Hi, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Blood Death Knight in the War Within Season 2. So just to recap how DK has been in Season 1, it was really great in Llarold Palace, easily the best tank in Raid, and I think it's going to be really good in the Liberation of Undermine as well. As for Mythic Plus Season 1, it was okay. It wasn't the worst tank, that was Brewmaster Monk, and I think for low-level keys, like weekly plus 10s and so on, I think DK is fantastic. It's very fun. And Death Grip is great, the self-healing is great. I think where DK struggles is in high-level pushing. The damage is actually great too. I didn't write that in my notes, but I just wanted to add that in as well. Damage is actually really great. The problem though, that high-level pushing is something that doesn't really apply to most players. Most people don't play the game at a high level. If they did, that would be the medium level, right? But it does apply to the players who set the meta, set the standard for the rest of the game and the rest of the community, and most people just copy that. So DK is perceived as being bad in all of Mythic Plus, even though it's really only bad at the high level. But it is bad at the high level, I can't argue that, and that's probably not going to change, so bear that in mind. And now let's get into the rest of the guide. So starting with changes to Blood DK, they are hilariously short. They actually missed one, but the main change here is just a 20% damage increase. Blood DK was already the best damaging tank in Raid, and it's keeping up with the pack for sure. It does actually deal pretty good damage in Mythic Plus as well, so that's pretty great. The only other change, and I'll just show this off in game, was to Coagulopathy, a decent little damage increase that you had to Death Strike every 8 seconds to maintain. Now you have to Death Strike every 12 seconds. Either of those was easy, so obviously, making it 50% easier is even easier, right? So very trivial change, but good. In terms of the tier set bonuses, just to kind of compare the old one with the new one, the old one gave you some Bone Shield charge, like Bone Shield charge generation, and some damage increase from having that Bone Shield charge generation. Ultra boring, like they might as well have just given you a couple thousand versatility. That would have worked just the same. And the upcoming tier set bonus, the 2-piece, makes it so that when you take damage, you have a chance to trigger Icebound Fortitude. Kind of boring, but it is it's shield wall, but it's also like a get out of stun free card, so that's kind of useful. And then more importantly, you get a pretty big damage increase, 15% for 10 seconds whenever that proc occurs as well. The 4-piece is a lot more interesting. When that 4-piece proc or that 2-piece proc occurs, it lasts a couple seconds longer, fine, whatever, but also it reduces the cost of Death Strike by 10 runic power, so dropping it down to 25. And it also makes it cleave 3 targets instead of just hitting 1. That is very good. You're not getting extra healing out of it, but it does so much damage. Death Strike is your hardest hitting skill. I think I cleared my logs recently, but in any case, Death Strike is always your hardest hitting skill. It's the majority of your damage, and now it's really going to be a lot more damage. So this 4-piece is very good offensively, and more Death Strikes for less runic power. That isn't bad defensively either. Obviously, that's great. So this is a great tier set. I'm actually very excited about it. So in terms of hero talents, I'll just start off with that and then kind of transition into regular talents. Deathbringer is very much a Mythic Plus only setup, I suppose. You can run it in Raid. It's, I think, the simpler of the 2 talent setups to run. I also think it's the one that's a little less fun. I think the biggest problem with Deathbringer versus Sandlane, and really the biggest problem I have with DK in general, is Deathbringer is built around this Reaper's Mark cooldown. You press Reaper's Mark on an enemy, it does a lot of damage, and puts a debuff on them, and you hit them with Blood Boil and your disease ticks and so on, and when it hits 40 stacks, it will explode and do a ton more damage. So once that happens, then you're able to hit them with a couple of Marrow Rends thanks to Exterminate. That will then potentially reapply Reaper's Mark, which is great, right? You can have this comboing, chaining, and get these really big burst damage cooldowns. Even if it doesn't chain, you're still able to get a lot of AoE damage. So that's great in Mythic Plus. And it doesn't require a lot of haste scaling. It's not really hard to maintain any buffs or anything like that. It's very easy to play. The issue with it is because it doesn't require any haste scaling, haste is your worst stat, and you kind of gear mastery versus crit haste. That's kind of your priority, and it's exactly the opposite for Sandlane. Haste is very valuable as Sandlane. Mastery is low value as Sandlane. It's exactly flip-flopped in terms of the stat budget. The preferred stat priority between Deathbringer and Sandlane are exactly opposite because the playstyles are, in a sense, very opposite. Deathbringer has this one specific new cooldown that it adds in, and that's a burst damage window, and it makes it very easy to maintain Bone Shield. Sand Lane is the opposite. It adds a bunch of damage onto using Dancing Rune Weapon, and then spamming Heart Strike and Death Strike during that time will give you a lot of stat budget, a lot of extra damage. And both of them are good. They both give you a lot of extra damage, but basically you play Deathbringer in Mythic Plus if you're really trying to be serious about it, and you play Sand Lane in Raids if you're trying to be really serious about it. So this is the standard Mythic Plus setup. I think the only thing that I do different from other players is I like to take Soul Reaper. I just like having that little bit of extra single target damage. I think most people would probably just take Permafrost for a bit more shielding, or maybe Control Undead if you're doing Theater of Pain to be able to like mind control some undead, or just take like Enfeeble for a bit of extra damage reduction. But I really like Soul Reaper, so I do take that. In the Spec tree, this is a pretty standard setup. You're taking Umbilicus Saturnus and improved Vampiric Blood, and just kind of going with a very defensive approach. If you wanted to like pump your damage up some more, you could drop the Imp Vamp Blood and Umbilicus and take improved Heart Strike and Bloodshot. This would be very similar to the Raid setup, and this would give you more damage, but at the cost of quite a bit more, or quite a bit of a loss of defense. And so just to switch over to the Raid setup, here we have a little bit of a different setup, but not by much. It pretty much is just those offensive talent swaps like I talked about. And then a little bit more emphasis on mobility. I do like to take March of Darkness in Raid. I like to take Wraith Walk. Obviously, depending on your group, you can take like Assimilation if you really need the damage reduction. That's true in Mythic Plus as well. It does juice the value of Anti-Magic Zone quite a bit. Also in Raid, you can swap out a couple of talents. I usually drop Voracious and Hemostasis if I need to take Gorfiend's Grasp and Tightening Grasp. There may not be any grip fights in the coming Raid, at least in testing it didn't feel like there were, so this may not be necessary, but if you do need Gorfiend's Grasp, if you need that, this is the setup I would go with. It's what I used on Worm Boss, and, I think if you wanted to swap around to be a little bit more tanky in this setup, like on Prog, I think I actually ran it more like this, where I took basically the Mythic Plus setup, except I was also taking Gorfiend's Grasp, and that's pretty much it. So in terms of the rotation, nothing has changed for Blood DK. You want to maintain Bone Shield all the time, at least 6 stacks of Bone Shield permanently. You want to use Dancing Rune Weapon whenever it's available. You want to use Tombstone and Bone Storm whenever they're available as well. You want to use Consumption whenever it's available to keep generating runes. You have all these cooldowns. You're pressing them pretty much on cooldown because they have nice interactions with each other or cooldown reduction built in. In terms of the actual rotation, you always want to maintain those Bone Shield charges and Blood Plague on your enemy with Blood Boil. You want to keep Death and Decay on the ground so that you're standing in it and getting all the benefits that come from that, the damage and the haste. And then you pretty much want to spend all the rest of your runes on Heart Strike, and you want to dump Runic Power before you hit full. And that's pretty much it. You never want to let more than 3 runes not be cooling down at a time, and you never want to hit full on Runic Power, and you're just kind of bouncing back and forth between those two, and then spinning the plates of all of the other things. You Blood Boil because it's at full charges, or you Death and Decay because it's about to fall off, or you Marrow Rend, or potentially Death's Caress if you're out of range because Bone Shield's about to fall off, and then you just keep Heart Striking and Death Striking. Pretty basic stuff. The only thing that really adds any sort of a wrinkle in there is Soul Reaper. When an enemy is below 35% health, you hit them with the Soul Reaper, it'll add a lot of damage. That's it, not very complex. So as I mentioned before, there is a bit of a stat disparity in terms of what you want for the 2 specs, whether you're doing Mythic Plus or Raid, which is, I think, the biggest thing that I find frustrating about DK. But essentially, as Sand Lane in Raid, I play Sand Lane in Mythic Plus because of this. Haste and Crit are your top 2 stats. In that order, Haste is definitely the most important. Verse is also good. Mastery is kind of fine. And then when you're playing Deathbringer, whether it's in Raid or Mythic Plus, whatever, Mastery and Versatility are really your top 2 stats. Crit's also good, but Haste is much, much weaker. You just really don't need much haste at all, as Deathbringer really doesn't add a lot of damage, whereas it's, godly as Sand Lane. Ultimately, in either case, what you really want is just more item level. Item level on all of your stats, but especially your weapon, is just really, really important. Also, one other thing just to mention is that Rune of Sanguination is super valuable. That is the go-to weapon enchant for any sort of single target damage. I absolutely use that as Sand Lane all the time, but definitely mandatory in Raid to run Rune of Sanguination. It just adds a lot of Death Strike damage. Alright, well that pretty much covers it. DK is really great right now. It's my #1 alt for the coming season, and if I wound up maining it instead of Paladin for some reason, I would actually be very happy. It's a great class, it's a lot of fun to play. I think it's not quite as fun as Pally, at least to me, but it's very close for sure. And arguably stronger in a lot of situations. You can really never go wrong playing Blood DK. Alright, that's it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more like it. And if you want to support us even further, consider becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching. Bye.